A number of years ago, in fact it's about I think 8 years ago, my family and I had the privilege of driving around a fair bit around Western Australia, and one of the highlights of our time there was visiting a place called Lucky Bay. I don't know if you've been to Lucky Bay, but it's lucky in name and lucky in that it might be the most beautiful beach in Australia. It is a magnificent spot. It's the widest of icing sugar sand. It's clear water, beautiful surrounds. At night, kangaroos literally come down to the beach to sit on the beach with you. It's amazing type space. But Lucky Bay is not easy to get to. In fact, it's more than 7 hours from Perth to a place called Esperance. That's where my family and I had been on a couple of days. But then it's another hour and a half from Esperance to Lucky Bay in a national park there. And we travelled to Lucky Bay one glorious day in April. Hour and a half sounds reasonable. 90 minutes later, though, I was travelling down a broken down bitumen road, having tried 3 different dirt roads trying to find my way there. I think that at one point I looked up to the stars for inspiration, and forgetting it was the middle of the day, so that's not going to work. And I don't even know how to navigate using that sort of thing. My phone was not getting any kind of, any reception. The sat-nav machine that I had didn't recognise any of the names. Very frustrating when you're in that particular space. You know the emotions that were coursing through my body at that time? And maybe you do because you've been in that sort of situation yourself. Frustration, anger, disappointment, confusion, all of them encapsulated in that idea of what am I going to do? Where are we? You know that feeling? That's exactly, I think, the same feeling that the readers of this letter from James had. They weren't confused to how to get to the most beautiful beach in Australia. They were unsure about how to live as a follower of Jesus in a world that rejected Jesus. What do we do? So James writes this powerful, this confronting letter to them. And in fact, if you've read through the letters as we've been going through this series over the last 6 weeks, you'll realise that he speaks about this answer, what do we do, in 3 different ways. The first thing he talked about the first couple of weeks when Matt Moran and myself spoke about was how do we handle some of the things that are going on inside us? Personally, what do we do? So when we're going through those difficult times in life, those trials, those struggles and things like that, how do we deal with them? And not only that, how then do we actually live out our faith in the world in a real way? He says that we should be what? We should be doers, not just listeners. He wants us not to be hypocrites, does he? So the first thing that he starts to ask about is what do we do inside us? How do we follow Jesus personally? But he doesn't just leave it there, does he? Because then he moves on and starts to talk about how do we live in a church community? How do we live with other people who are followers of Jesus? And he talked about a couple of areas there. He kind of puts his finger on a couple of areas. He says, first of all, he says, don't show favoritism. Don't honour this person and then reject that person. And you know what that's like. Oh, this person's more important. They're wealthier. They're better looking. They've got more talents and gifts. Take your pick. He says, don't show any favoritism. And then he goes on, and Cam shared this confronting message about how do we use our tongues. When we're in a community, we should use the words that we speak for good, not evil. It's really in your face, isn't it? It's explaining what do we do in a community. It goes on, and then Megan shared a little bit further about don't even have any fights and quarrels. What were those 2 things that she spoke about, which she said are kind of expressions of the problem of the heart? Jealousy and pride get in the way. The last thing that he wants to speak about is not only how do we live as a follower of Jesus in ourselves, how do we live as a follower of Jesus in the church community. He wants to speak about how do we live as a Christian in the world, in the 24/7 of life, in our neighbourhoods, in our sporting clubs, in our recreation groups, in our workplaces, our schools. Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow, in James 4:13, we are going to a certain town and we'll stay there a year. We'll do business there and we'll make a profit. It's actually understood that this is kind of almost like a quote, a saying from the day. We'll stay there a year and make a profit. Now, many years ago, I worked in the finance department of Hewlett Packard, you know, the large computer company, make printers and all those sorts of things. And for probably 2 to 3 months of every year, we would spend a considerable amount of time in intensive budgeting. Plans were made. Targets were set. Expenses were detailed and refined until finally a beautiful set of numbers were produced. A beautiful set of numbers were produced that we were confident could be achieved and, more importantly, produce the right bottom line. You know, the first century was also a period of great commercial activity. Many of the Jews were actively involved in business comings and goings, and large numbers of them centred around the Mediterranean world for commercial reasons. They didn't have the same tools that we do in the 21st century, but they were deliberate. They were self-confident planners. They decided where they would go, how long they would stay, and they were certain that they would gain profits from the ventures they embarked on. You know, it takes a certain confidence, doesn't it? A certain self-assurance to get to that place. Some might even call it arrogance. And this is what James wants to speak about here in the world. It's not a desire to make a profit that James criticises. He's concerned about this underlying belief of the business people. This arrogance that we control our destiny. Why was he pinpointing the business people? Well, in the Old Testament, there was kind of an intense distrust of people who were in that space. So you can read verses like in Micah 6 where it talks about the merchants. What were they doing? They were ripping off their customers and exploiting their workers. It took them a time to get that sort of reputation. You know, it's kind of like the reputation of a car salesman today. They were people who believed that they controlled their destiny. I hold the future. But what James says is that they had failed to reckon with a fundamental fact. The world is transitory. It is the height of arrogance to believe that you control your destiny. The exemplar of foolishness to believe that you will know what happens tomorrow. So what does he say to them? How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? It's like the morning fog. Here a little while, and then it's gone. You know this, don't you? Our best laid plans of mice and men kind of quickly get eaten away because life is short and uncontrollable. Illness, death, the return of Jesus. Anything could see our lives quickly change like the morning sun gets rid of the mist and the fog. Is James advising his readers to never make plans in the world? Well, no. But what he's saying is this. Remember, he's saying, remember, it's God who holds the world in his hands, not you, not me. He's saying, remember that and trust God in that place. Proverbs put it this way, he says, don't brag about tomorrow since you don't know what the day will bring. But what James says in that is trust in God's graciousness. We ought to say, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, what? We're boasting about our own pretentiousness. You want to know how to live in the world? James says, it's okay to make plans, but trust in the God who controls the world, not in your own strength and arrogance. How do you twig with that in your own life and space? Are you a controller or you're a truster? The second thing that James wants to talk about in this space is money. Money's a hot topic at the moment. I read an article during the week that if you have a mortgage of $800,000, not unrealistic if you're a recent home buyer in the mortgage belt burbs of Melbourne, that your repayments have gone up $1,100 a month this year. $1,100 a month, $13,500 a year. That's a lot of money. I still get a bit of what I think is kind of like pump shock when I fill my car up. Easy hits $150, and I know that there are many others who feel in this same difficult space. Rising interest rates, 7% inflation. We're feeling the hit. But let me ask you a question this morning. Do you think you're wealthy? Do you think you're wealthy? What do you think you need to earn to be wealthy? Or how much do you think you need to own? It's said that happiness is understood to increase with income. You know, the more money I earn, the happier I will be. The research actually tells us that is right, to a point. Right to a point. It said that once people get over the immediate hump of knowing that they're able to have a roof over their head and food on their table, that essentially the happiness sort of measures level off and then drop. A Nobel Prize-winning economist by the name of Daniel Kahneman did some studies a number of years ago, and at that point in time in the United States, the figure that they found as the inflection point was about $70,000. In 2019 at the University of Sydney, they did a similar study and they found the number in Australia at that particular point in time was $74,000. Do you think you're wealthy? In fact, on the happiness scale, as it goes up like this, once it reaches that certain point, it actually starts to decline. And for those who are statistically minded, the correlation that they find between income and happiness is measured in the vicinity of 2 to 10% in terms of a correlation factor. In other words, what it's saying is it's very low. Do you think you're wealthy? Look here, you rich people. Weep and groan with anguish because of all the terrible troubles ahead of you. Your wealth is rotting away. Your fine clothes are moth-eaten rags. Your gold and silver are corroded. The very wealth you were counting on will eat away your flesh like fire. This corroded treasure you have hoarded will testify against you on the day of judgment. For listen, hear the cries of the field workers whom you've cheated of their pay. The cries of those who harvest your fields have reached the ears of the Lord of heaven's armies. You've spent your years on earth in luxury, satisfying your every desire. You've fattened yourselves for the day of slaughter. You've condemned and killed innocent people who do not resist you. Do you think you're wealthy? Or ask yourself this question. What does wealth breed? What does it breed? What does it grow? Humility or self-confidence? Gratefulness or greed? Serving others or self-interest? What does it breed? The rich people that James pictured here were the wealthy landowners of that society. They were a class accused of economic exploitation and oppression of the workers. They didn't pay the wages of their people in full or on time. They received the gifts, the power of having the money, but it bred horrible characteristics within, and he talks about that they will weep because they will receive the consequences of those actions. What does wealth breed? Does it breed personal security, or does it breed trust in God? You see, James's first warning to his readers was about the sense that they could control the world that they were a part of, that they could control time, that they could control destiny. And here, essentially, he's pointing to the same issue, just expressed in a different way. It wasn't time they were using as a tool. Now it was money that they were using as a tool. Their pursuit of wealth disregarded God. Their desire for money placed that as the idol front and centre of life. Do you consider yourself wealthy? You know, when I ever ask that question of myself, the next question that I always ask is this, is why would I consider myself wealthy, or why would I not consider myself wealthy? And ultimately that question is answered in this way: comparison. You know, comparison may be the most insidious of behaviour, isn't it? It gets under your skin. It sneaks up on you. You don't invite it, it just comes. And we compare. All the research when we talk about comparison says this: we only ever compare ourselves with those who we believe are in a higher socioeconomic station. Look at myself compared to the vehicle that person drives. Look at the house they live in. Comparison only operates that way. A Brazilian archbishop and author by the name of Dom Helder Camara said this. He said, "I used to think when I was a child that Christ was exaggerating when he warned about the dangers of wealth. Today I know better. I know how hard it is to be rich and still keep the milk of human kindness. Money has a dangerous way of putting scales on one's eyes, a dangerous way of freezing people's hands, eyes, lips, and hearts." What does it say about us if we want to pile up wealth? I mean, how much is enough? And normally the answer to that question is just a little more. What is it about when we're tempted to hoard rather than be generous to those in need? In what sense is the God that we worship and the God that we follow also the God of our bank accounts? The God of our future, the God of our superannuation? What do I trust in versus who do I trust in? You know, one of the astounding realities of life in Western nations is that we honestly think we have barely enough to live. But as Ronald Sider put it, the reality is for anybody living in a Western nation, we are in the wealthiest 5% of people in the world, no matter what. Controlling my time, controlling money. Think about how susceptible we are to these matters in the 21st century. Think of that. I mean, this was the things that James is pointing out to his readers 2,000 years ago, and yet I actually feel like it'd be more pertinent today. I mean, how much more power have we got? Everything kind of depends on ourselves. We want to own and control every last detail in our lives. What a temptation. You know, Jesus warned us that wealth can be a particularly strong obstacle to entering the kingdom of God. How difficult is it for that to happen? Why? Because it's trusting in money. It's trusting in control of time, not trusting in Jesus. And that's simply what it boils down to, isn't it? And that's James' message to his listeners then. And so, you know, like James is, to be frank, is not an easy book to read. Well, actually, maybe it's okay to read. The problem is actually trying to do what it says. It's really confronting. It really hits you between the eyes, doesn't it? Because the practical kind of advice is clear, it's insightful, it speaks to our daily life. Persevering through trials, being a doer, not just a believer, not showing favoritism, don't fight, use your words for good, not evil, trust in God, don't believe you can control every aspect of your life, get rid of your pride, your jealousy. I mean, it's enough there for a sermon series, isn't it? And it's in your face. But I've got to say, as we kind of finish up this series, that listening to it over these weeks of those different issues that it raised has left me at times wondering and contemplating. I've been chewing over in my head how I handle the direct advice and also, on the other hand, the tension and at times the compromise I feel in my own life. I mean, how can I call myself a follower of Jesus and yet be hypocritical? How is it that my tongue, this, 2.5 inches of flesh and a lot of blood, can speak both blessings and curses? How is it that I'm called to give and have a new heart, and yet I still find myself racked with problems of jealousy and pride? Each one of us probably can identify with different parts of the two issues that were raised today. Trying to control my future and my destiny, trying to control it through money. And as I listened to them, I found myself wanting to say, yes, Matt, I heard that. Yes, Ben, I heard that. I want to live my faith out every day. I don't want to be a hypocrite. Cam, I heard you say, use my tongue for good, not evil. Megan, I heard you say, I want to have a heart that's content, that's not always comparing with others and being jealous. I want to have a heart that's humble, not full of ego. I want that, but I find myself too often not in that space. What I want, what I hope for is not always the reality of my life. Do you understand that? Do you identify with that? Don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? If you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. And I ask myself, is that me at times? And sadly, I know the answer is yes. Or I read the verse a few verses later which says, wash your hands, you sinners, purify your heart, for your loyalty is divided. And too often I find myself in that space. I shake my head in frustration. Maybe it's anger, definitely disappointment. If God's Spirit is within me, why am I not more faithful? Do you ever ask yourself that question? You know, when no one else is around, when no one else is watching you? Do you ever ask yourself that? Maybe at night when you close your eyes and you reflect on some of the things that have happened in the day. Or after you've been in the presence of people who kind of know how to push your buttons the wrong way and you go, I wish I had changed differently. In a particular space where you feel most vulnerable. Why? I identify the words of Paul when he writes about this same feeling in Romans. He says, I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. If I know that what I'm doing is wrong, well, this shows that I agree that the law is good. So I'm not doing wrong, it's sin living in me that does it. He's saying there's a problem with me. I want to do right, but I don't. And my problem is there's sin still living in me. How do you resolve this tension? How do you resolve it? In yourself. I mean, does it come down to like this sort of black and white question? Well, if I'm doing good, I'm a real follower of Jesus. But if I stumble, if I fall, well, then I'm a fraud. Is it that simple? Kind of that black and white? I want to say to you this morning that I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake for us to think of our journey of faith as like a light switch type faith. It's either on or it's off. It's either 100% good or it's 100% a failure. I actually think of my faith more in sense of the term of like a dimmer switch, I suspect most of you have got a dimmer switch in your house, It's dull or it's a bit brighter or it's glowing more. Because I think that life as a follower of Jesus is not a straight line. We wrestle, don't we? We wrestle with sin in the world and sin in our lives. We want to be right with God in a place without sin, living a life completely devoted to Jesus. But that's the destination. And we're on that journey to get into that space because we're not quite there. You see, the reality is that as followers of Jesus in the 21st century, we're living in two worlds. The world of a selfish, me-centered life and the world in which Jesus is the center of my life. We're living in a place where I've been forgiven of my sin, and yet I still wrestle with my sin. We're living in a place where I've been forgiven, but I still need to be forgiven. We're living as a follower of Jesus that our lives are being transformed and continue to be transformed. That didn't just happen kind of in a sense once and for all at some time in the past, but our lives are being transformed every single day. I like to think of faith as like the equivalent of growing a plant. At my house, I have a number of planter boxes, and at the moment in the planter box of my life, there are a number of tomatoes that are taking centre stage. How many people here grow tomatoes? That's not enough. You ought to be ashamed for all the rest of you don't. Homegrown tomatoes are much better than the tomatoes that you grow at the store. But tomatoes, you think about the life cycle of them. The seeds are put under the soil. You can't see them, can you? Is there any activity? You can't see any with your eyes, but you know that in that seed, something is happening. Some change is happening, even though you can't necessarily see it. But now come November, someone once told me that you're meant to plant your tomato seedlings, like Cup Day. Because we're into November, some action's starting to happen, isn't it? So for those of you who've got tomatoes on the go, what's happening with your tomatoes at the moment? They've broken the surface, haven't they? So I have a number of kind of like seedlings that are starting to sprout up. The biggest of mine is probably about this sort of size at the moment. It's broken through the surface, it's starting to grow. I know that in 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, that tomato plant will grow and mature. And then the fruit will come, and so will the birds. And whatever fruit we get left, we'll try to eat. It's the nature of a plant growing. It's kind of the nature of how faith works in our life, doesn't it? I receive a new heart. It's like the start of that seed that has that potential. I don't always see the evidence of it, but I know it's starting to grow and change. I see it start to break the surface. And so once upon a time when I was angry and I would have punched someone in the head, now I learn to hold my punch back. And later on when it matures, I learn to speak life or encouragement into that person because the change happens. It's the nature of faith growing. Fruit is realised as it matures. And James, I think, knows this as well. And so he leaves us with these words in this book. He says, "Dear brothers and sisters, be patient as you wait for the Lord's return. Consider the farmers who wait patiently for the rains and in the autumn and the spring. They look for the valuable harvest to ripen. You too must be patient. Take courage, for the coming of the Lord is near. You see, the struggle of these Christians in a world that rejected Jesus was not an easy struggle just to switch off. They lived in a place where they were wrestling with what it was to live as a Christian in the world. Like you are, like I am. And James says, have patience. He says, hang in there, have hope. He says the farmer must wait patiently for the work to be done. He says the prophets went through incredible amounts of struggle. I mean, Job, he went through, his life was destroyed, but he endured. He didn't abandon God. The prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they copped a barrage from people around them, but they persisted. And he says to them, hang in there. He says, for examples of patience in suffering, brothers and sisters, look at those prophets. We give great honour to those who endure under suffering. You know about Job. You see, the Lord was kind to him, for the Lord is full of tenderness and mercy. The Lord is full of tenderness and mercy. And I want to say to each one of you today, you know, as you've copped these sort of almost like these punches between the eyes as we've talked about these various issues that James has identified, and that probably you, as the same as myself, have felt great conviction at some point in time. It might have been your tongue, it might have been fear, it might have been pride, it might have been jealousy, it might be money, it might be controlling time, whatever it is. And what James is saying is hang in there. Let your faith in Jesus continue to transform. Hang in there. Be patient. For the Lord is full of tenderness and mercy. The Lord is full of tenderness and mercy. And you know, as I read those words again and again, it's what gives me hope. I know that my life is not perfect. I know that there are times when I might feel like, oh, you did it again, Harris, you idiot. But then I remind myself, the Lord is full of tenderness and mercy. And that gives me hope. And it's my prayer for you that whatever space that you're in, whatever the things that you're dealing with directly, whatever the things that are most challenging to you in your heart, the things that you're wrestling with the most, that you will hang in there. Remember the nature of God, full of tenderness and mercy. Let's pray together. For our God, we know the struggle of living as one of your followers in this world. We know the tensions that rack our hearts, the issues that confront us. And our God, we never want to ignore them. We want to continue to let the seeds of faith transform us, to help us to be doers, to help us to endure trials, to help us to speak words of encouragement and blessing, to help us to be humble, to help us to be satisfied and content, to help us to trust you. Father, I pray that your Spirit would bring that transformation. And God, we know that you will, because you are a God who is full of tenderness and mercy. And so as much as we grieve and we wrestle with the struggles, we thank you for the nature of who you are, that God of love, tenderness and mercy. Amen.